Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Philip Kindred Dick, the novelist who turned reality inside out and found gods hiding in the static. Together and apart, they mapped territories where the mind becomes uncertain of its own borders, where vision bleeds into madness and revelation arrives wearing the mask of paranoia. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approached the unstable ground of human consciousness. One seeing the psyche as the mediator between self and cosmos, constructing reality through symbolic patterns older than memory, the other discovering that reality itself might be a flickering transmission, a divine program running on uncertain hardware, subject to interference, breakdown, and sudden revision. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories where human consciousness confronts its own constructed nature. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Philip Dick as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. Carl Gustav Jung was born in 1875 in Switzerland, into a world that still believed in its own solidity. The son and grandson of Protestant ministers, young Carl grew up surrounded by the language of faith, but also by the silences that gather around questions no doctrine can answer. His father, Carl Jung, was a country parson whose faith, Carl later suspected, had hollowed out from within, leaving only the shell of ritual and duty. His mother, Emily, was a more mysterious presence, warm and nurturing by day, but at night transforming into what Carl called her other personality, speaking in voices that seemed to come from depths she herself did not recognize. This duality in his mother became for Jung an early glimpse into the multiplicity of the psyche, the way a single person could house many voices, many selves. The young Carl was a solitary, introspective child given to vivid dreams and fantasies. He played alone for hours, carving small figures from wood and stone, creating what he would later recognize as early attempts to give form to the invisible forces he sensed moving through the world. He had a secret ritual, a carved wooden man he kept hidden with a painted stone, visiting them like sacred objects, feeling obscurely that they connected him to something larger and older than his conscious understanding could grasp. These early experiences planted seeds that would bloom decades later into his theory of archetypes, those primordial patterns that structure human experience across all cultures and times. Jung entered the University of Basel in 1895 to study medicine, but it was his encounter with psychiatry that ignited his true calling. Reading a textbook description of psychiatry as the study of diseases of the personality, Jung experienced a sudden, overwhelming revelation. Here was the intersection of everything that fascinated him, the biological and the spiritual, the scientific and the mysterious, the study of nature and the exploration of the soul. He chose to specialize in psychiatry, much to the disappointment of his surgical professors, and began his career at the Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich under the direction of Eugen Bleuler. At the Bergholzli, Jung immersed himself in the chaotic world of severe mental illness. He spoke with patients others dismissed as simply mad, listening with genuine curiosity to their delusions and hallucinations. He developed word association tests, measuring the time it took patients to respond to stimulus words, discovering that certain words created delays, emotional reactions, and disturbances that revealed what he called complexes, emotionally charged clusters of ideas and feelings operating beneath conscious awareness. This work brought him to the attention of Sigmund Freud, and the two men began an intense correspondence in 1906 that would lead to a deep but ultimately troubled relationship. For several years, Freud regarded Jung as his heir apparent, the Gentile son who would carry psychoanalysis beyond its Viennese Jewish origins into the broader world. They traveled together to America in 1909, analyzing each other's dreams on the ship crossing the Atlantic, but tensions already stirred beneath the surface. Jung found Freud's insistence on the sexual etiology of all neurosis too narrow, too reductive. He sensed in the human psyche layers that predated personal experience, collective patterns that could not be explained by individual biography alone. The break came in 1912 and 13, catalyzed by Jung's publication of Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, later revised as Symbols of Transformation. In this work, Jung reinterpreted libido not as exclusively sexual energy, but as a generalized life force, and he explored mythological symbols as expressions of universal psychic patterns. Freud saw this as a betrayal, a retreat from the hard-won insights of psychoanalysis into the comforting abstractions of philosophy and mysticism. The relationship ended bitterly, and Jung entered a period of profound psychological crisis. What followed between 1913 and 1919 was Jung's confrontation with his own unconscious, an ordeal he would later describe as his most important work. He withdrew from the outer world as much as his clinical practice allowed and turned inward, deliberately inducing fantasies and visions, conversing with figures that emerged from his own depths. He encountered a wise old man he named Philemon, who taught him that thoughts and psychic contents have their own independent life. He descended into landscapes of myth and terror, witnessed cosmic dramas, experienced himself as multiple beings across different times. All of this he recorded in what became known as the Red Book, a large folio volume filled with illuminated calligraphy and paintings, not published until 2009, decades after his death. This visionary period was both a breakdown and a breakthrough. Jung experienced it as a near-psychotic episode, a descent into the chaos that borders madness, but he emerged from it with the conviction that the visions contained objective truths about the structure of the psyche. The figures he encountered, Philemon, Salome, the serpent, the heroes and demons, were not merely his personal creations, but representatives of what he would call archetypes, universal patterns of human experience that exist in the collective unconscious, the deep stratum of the psyche shared by all humanity. From this experience, Jung built his mature psychology. He proposed that beneath the personal unconscious described by Freud lay the collective unconscious, a realm of inherited psychic structures that shape how we experience gods, heroes, mothers, fathers, death, rebirth, and all the fundamental situations of human life. These archetypal patterns manifest in myths, fairy tales, religious symbols, and individual dreams. The task of psychological development, which Jung called individuation, involves bringing these unconscious contents into relationship with consciousness, not through rational understanding alone, but through symbolic engagement, through honoring the images and narratives through which the psyche speaks. Jung continued developing these ideas through the 1920s and 30s, writing prolifically on archetypes, the structure of the psyche, psychological types, synchronicity, and the symbolic meanings found in alchemy, Gnosticism, and Eastern philosophy. He saw himself not as a mystic, but as an empiricist of the inner world, someone who observed and categorized the phenomena of the psyche with the same rigor a botanist brings to plants. Yet his empiricism included the visionary, the numinous, the irreducibly mysterious dimensions of human experience that scientific materialism struggled to accommodate. When World War II erupted, Jung watched with horror as collective archetypal forces swept through Germany, the ancient Germanic gods Wotan and the shadow side of the heroic myth possessing an entire nation. He saw in Nazism the terrible power of unintegrated archetypal energy, the way repressed psychic contents can erupt from the collective unconscious and seize control of consciousness, turning human beings into instruments of impersonal forces they do not understand. This confirmed for him the vital importance of psychological work, of bringing the shadow into awareness, of consciously engaging with the archetypal dimensions of the psyche rather than being unconsciously possessed by them. Jung continued his work into old age, exploring ever deeper into the territories where psychology, religion, and metaphysics converge. He died in 1961, leaving behind a body of work that the psychiatric mainstream often regarded with suspicion too mystical, too philosophical, too willing to take seriously phenomena that could not be measured and quantified, but that resonated deeply with those seeking a psychology that honored the soul's complexity and depth. Now, shift your attention across decades and oceans to another consciousness forming itself in very different soil. Philip Kindred Dick was born in Chicago in 1928, an identical twin. His sister, Jane, died at 5 weeks old, possibly from malnutrition, possibly from maternal neglect. Their mother, Dorothy, was psychologically fragile, possibly psychotic, certainly unable to care adequately for her infant children. Philip survived, Jane did not. This primal wound, this original loss of his twin, haunted Philip for his entire life. He felt himself to be fundamentally incomplete, half of a whole that had been severed, forever seeking reunion with the dead sister who represented the missing piece of himself. His childhood was marked by instability. His parents divorced when he was 5, and he moved with his mother to California, where they lived in financial precarity and emotional chaos. Dorothy was demanding, volatile, perhaps abusive. Philip developed intense anxiety, phobias, and what he later described as a pervasive sense that reality was not quite right, not quite solid, that something fundamental was being hidden or falsified. These childhood perceptions, born partly from his traumatic early experiences and partly from some quirk of his neurology, became the bedrock of his literary imagination. He was a precocious, intellectually hungry child who haunted used bookstores and libraries, devouring philosophy, science fiction, and anything that offered an alternative to the gray surfaces of conventional reality. He discovered science fiction in his teens and recognized it immediately as his medium, the genre that would allow him to dramatize his persistent intuition that consensus reality was a kind of illusion, a construct that could be questioned, deconstructed, and reimagined. Dick began publishing science fiction stories in the early 1950s during the genre's pulp magazine era. He wrote compulsively, driven by financial need and creative urgency, producing dozens of short stories and novels throughout the 50s and 60s. His early work was uneven, marked by pulp conventions, but even in those early stories, distinctive themes emerged: the instability of reality, the question of what it means to be human, the tyranny of false realities imposed by governments or corporations, the presence of empathy as the defining human quality, and the possibility that our world might be a simulation or deception masking some deeper, stranger truth. His breakthrough novel, The Man in the High Castle, published in 1962, presented an alternate history where the Axis powers won World War II. But the novel's deeper concern was epistemological. How do we know what's real? Within the novel's alternate world, characters read a banned book imagining a world where the Allies won, though that imagined world doesn't match our actual history either. Reality layers upon reality, each claiming authenticity, none quite stable. The novel won the Hugo Award and established Dick as a major science fiction writer, though mainstream literary recognition remained elusive. Through the 1960s, Dick's personal life spiraled into increasing chaos. He married and divorced 5 times, struggled with amphetamine addiction, moved through a series of rented houses, and cycled through intense periods of productivity and devastating crashes. His novels from this period, Martian Timeslip, The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, Ubik grew stranger and more brilliant, depicting realities that shifted mid-narrative, characters who discover they might be androids or precogs or trapped in someone else's hallucination or already dead. The consensus reality maintained by authorities in Dick's novels is almost always revealed to be false, a simulation designed to control and exploit. Beneath the false surface lies another reality, though that deeper reality is often no more stable or trustworthy than the illusion it replaces. His characters are typically ordinary people, salesmen, repairmen, small-time operators, suddenly forced to question the basic parameters of their existence. They discover they have false memories, that they're living in constructed environments, that the world has ended and they haven't noticed, that time has fractured, that competing realities are vying for ontological dominance. The ground never stops shifting beneath their feet. Dick lived much of this instability himself. He was convinced the FBI was watching him, that his house had been broken into by government agents, that conspiracies surrounded him. Some of this was amphetamine-induced paranoia, but some may have been accurate. His anti-authoritarian views and involvement with Bay Area counterculture in the late 60s and early 70s did attract surveillance. The line between justified suspicion and paranoid delusion became impossible for him to determine a fitting condition. For a writer whose work insisted that such distinctions might be fundamentally undecidable. Then, in February and March of 1974, something happened to Philip K. Dick that transformed his life and his work. He had a wisdom tooth extracted, and a woman from the pharmacy delivered his pain medication to his house. She wore a necklace with a golden fish symbol, the ancient Christian ichthys. When Dick asked her about it, and the sunlight hit the golden fish, he was struck by what he experienced as a beam of pink light that carried immense information directly into his consciousness. What followed over the next 2 months was a series of experiences Dick struggled for the rest of his life to interpret. He had vivid, hypnagogic visions, felt his consciousness invaded by or merged with another intelligence, experienced what he called two-source awareness, where he was simultaneously Philip K. Dick, in 1974 California, and a Christian named Thomas living in Rome during the 1st century A.D., suffering persecution. He saw ancient Gnostic and Kabbalistic symbols, received what he interpreted as messages or transmissions, became convinced that reality as we experience it is a kind of black iron prison, a false construct imposed by a demiurge or malevolent reality principle, and that the true God is a hidden saving force working to break through the prison walls. Dick called this invading or liberating intelligence VALIS, an acronym for Vast Active Living Intelligence System. He believed VALIS might be God, might be an artificial intelligence, might be a satellite in orbit, might be information itself achieving consciousness, might be an alien intelligence, might be the Logos, might be all of these simultaneously. He spent the remaining 8 years of his life trying to understand what had happened to him, filling thousands of pages of journal entries he called his exegesis, exploring Gnosticism, early Christianity, Neoplatonism, theology, philosophy, and science in an attempt to integrate the experience. The novels he wrote after 1974, particularly Valis, The Divine Invasion, and The Transmigration of Timothy Archer, are his most explicitly metaphysical, dealing directly with divine revelation, spiritual search, and the possibility that our world is a prison of false reality, that true knowledge can help us escape. These late novels are often described as Gnostic, and Dick himself identified strongly with the ancient Gnostics, those heretical Christians who believed the material world was created by a false god, and that salvation comes through secret knowledge that reveals our true divine nature. Dick died in 1982 at age 53 from a stroke, having never fully resolved whether his 1974 experiences were mystical revelation, psychotic episode, or something that transcended that binary. His literary reputation grew enormously after his death as film. Adaptations of his work, Blade Runner, Total Recall, Minority Report, and many others, brought his reality-bending visions to mass audiences, and as the digital age made his speculations about simulated reality and unstable identity seem increasingly prophetic. Here, then, are two men who never met, who inhabited different worlds. One, a Swiss psychiatrist working in the first half of the 20th century, the other an American science fiction writer working in the second half. Yet the territories they explored overlap with uncanny precision. Both confronted the instability of the reality we take for granted. Both experienced profound visionary episodes that shattered their previous understanding and gave them access to domains of knowledge not available through ordinary consciousness. Both wrestled with the multiplicity of identity, the way a single person houses many selves. Both took seriously the possibility that what we call madness might contain valid perceptions, not available to consensus consciousness. Both drew extensively on Gnosticism and ancient mystery religions to understand their experiences. Both saw the human condition as involving imprisonment in false or limited reality and the possibility of liberation through knowledge or integration. Yet they approached these territories from entirely different angles, used radically different languages, and arrived at conclusions that sometimes harmonize and sometimes clash. Jung sought to map the psyche systematically, to create a stable geography of its territories, to establish individuation as a process of integration that leads to wholeness. Dick inhabited instability as his natural state, distrusted all maps, and found in fragmentation and paranoia not problems to overcome, but lenses that revealed truths invisible to conventional perception. Jung wanted to heal the split between consciousness and the unconscious. Dick was never sure there was anything to heal, or whether the split itself might be revelatory. To understand their relationship, we must understand that they are, in a sense, inverted twins. Jung descended voluntarily into the chaos of the unconscious and emerged with a method to contain and work with what he found there. Dick never had the luxury of choosing his descent. Instability was his native condition, and he learned to navigate its treacherous currents without ever finding solid ground. Jung is the systematic thinker trying to make the irrational comprehensible. Dick is the irrational made articulate, reporting from territories that resist systematization. Jung offers a psychology of integration. Dick offers a poetry of permanent disintegration that nevertheless carries strange intimations of transcendence. The cultural contexts that shaped them were vastly different. Jung came of age in late 19th century Europe, in a culture that was just beginning to grapple with the implications of Darwinism, the decline of religious certainty, and the rise of industrial modernity. Yet, European culture still maintained substantial continuity with its past, still lived within traditions that connected back through centuries. Jung could draw on alchemy, Gnosticism, and medieval Christianity, not as exotic curiosities, but as part of his own cultural heritage, layers of symbolic wisdom sedimented in the European psyche. Dick grew up in mid-20th century America, in the shadow of World War II, the atomic bomb, and the emerging Cold War paranoia. His formative intellectual influences included pulp science fiction, film noir, and the creeping awareness that totalitarianism could emerge not only from foreign ideologies, but from the conformist pressures of American democracy itself. He came of age just as television was becoming ubiquitous, mediating reality through screens, replacing direct experience with broadcast images. He lived through McCarthyism, the Kennedy assassination, Vietnam, Watergate, an endless series of revelations that authorities lied, that official reality was a construction designed to obscure uncomfortable truths. Where Jung could still assume a meaningful cosmos structured by archetypal patterns that pointed toward wholeness, Dick inherited a postmodern condition where meaning was uncertain, where the grand narratives had collapsed, where reality itself seemed more like static than symbol. Where Jung sought connection to ancient wisdom, Dick experienced that same ancient material as fragments erupting into a present that had lost its historical continuity, pieces of Gnosticism and Kabbalism arriving not as tradition but as alien transmissions from dead civilizations. Yet for all these differences, both men had the quality of the wounded healer, the shamanic sensibility that undergoes dissolution in order to bring back knowledge. Jung's confrontation with the unconscious after his break with Freud had the structure of a shamanic initiation descent into chaos encounter, with spirits and guides, return with new vision. Dick's entire life had this structure stretched out across decades, a permanent liminality between worlds, a consciousness that never quite settled into consensus reality, and so could report on the strangeness that lies just beneath its surface. Let us now move deeper into the parallel territories these two men mapped, examining how their core concepts relate, where their visions overlap, and where they diverge into different landscapes entirely. Jung's central concept of the collective unconscious proposes a level of the psyche deeper than personal experience, a realm of inherited psychic structures shared by all humanity. This is not genetic inheritance in the simple sense, but something more mysterious, the accumulated wisdom or structure of human experience across evolutionary time, crystallized into patterns that shape how we perceive and respond to fundamental life situations. The collective unconscious expresses itself through archetypes, which are not inherited ideas, but inherited predispositions to form certain kinds of images and narratives. The archetype of the mother, for instance, exists across all cultures not as identical imagery, but as a pattern that constellates maternal experiences, nurturing and devouring, protective and possessive, the source of life and the return to earth. Every individual encounters actual mothers shaped by their particular culture and personal quirks. But those encounters activate the archetypal layer, the deep structure that gives the mother figure its numinous power, its ability to evoke feelings far beyond what the individual person might warrant. Jung identified numerous archetypes: the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the trickster, the self, the great mother, the hero, and many others. These are not static entities, but dynamic principles, patterns of energy and image that shape consciousness from below. They appear in dreams, myths, religious symbols, and the spontaneous fantasies of individuals who have never read mythology. Their universality, Jung argued, demonstrates that the psyche is not a blank slate written on only by personal experience, but has its own inherent structure, its own deep grammar. The process of individuation that Jung saw as the central task of the second half of life involves bringing these unconscious archetypal contents into relationship with consciousness. This does not mean eradicating the unconscious or becoming purely conscious, which Jung saw as impossible and undesirable. Rather, it means developing a relationship with the unconscious, learning its symbolic language, integrating what can be integrated, particularly shadow aspects we have disowned, and maintaining a creative tension between consciousness and the unconscious depths that can never be fully known or controlled. Dick did not use the language of the collective unconscious, but his work is permeated with the intuition that individual consciousness is not isolated but connected to larger, transpersonal dimensions. His characters repeatedly discover that their minds contain more than they thought, that memories and knowledge that seem personal are actually coming from elsewhere. In Ubik, characters experience intrusions of different time periods into their present, as if consciousness is not confined to a single temporal location. In the three stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, the boundaries between individual minds dissolve as characters enter a shared hallucinatory space structured by archetypal images, particularly the invasive presence of Palmer. Eldritch himself, whose three stigmata, artificial arm, eyes, and teeth, mark those he has possessed or colonized. Dick's recurring narrative of the tomb world, or black iron prison, is essentially a vision of fallen reality, a Gnostic myth of entrapment and false materiality. This connects deeply with Jung's concept of unconscious identification, the state of being possessed by archetypal patterns without awareness, living out scripts written in the collective unconscious without consciousness of what is happening. For Jung, this unconscious condition is the normal state of humanity, and the work of individuation is to achieve some degree of conscious freedom from total identification with these patterns. For Dick, the prison of false reality is more absolute and more sinister, not just a psychological condition, but an ontological trap, a literally false universe maintained by some malevolent or indifferent principle. Yet both saw the possibility of liberation. For Jung, it comes through the individuation process, through becoming conscious of what was unconscious, through integrating the shadow and establishing relationship with the self, the archetype of wholeness. For Dick, it comes through anamnesis, the Gnostic concept of remembering one's true divine nature, breaking through the amnesia imposed by the false reality, recognizing the saving gnosis that reveals the prison for what it is. Where they diverge significantly is in their attitude toward this process. Jung's is essentially therapeutic, aimed at wholeness and health, at achieving a balance between consciousness and unconscious that allows for creative living. Dick's is more ambiguous. Is the breaking through of gnosis healing or further destabilization? His characters who achieve awareness often become more alienated, more paranoid, more cut off from ordinary functioning. The liberation Dick imagines rarely brings peace. More often, it brings exile from the comfortable illusions that allow others to function. Consider their shared interest in Gnosticism. Jung devoted considerable attention to Gnostic texts, seeing in them early maps of the psyche, proto-psychological insights encoded in mythological language. The Gnostic demiurge, the false god who creates the material world as a prison, represents for Jung the ego's identification with consciousness alone, mistaking its limited light for the totality of being, unaware of the greater pleroma or fullness that includes both light and darkness, consciousness and unconscious. The Gnostic journey from ignorance to knowledge parallels the individuation process from unconsciousness to consciousness. But Jung also criticized certain Gnostic tendencies, the devaluation of matter, the radical dualism that pits spirit against flesh, the desire to escape the body and the world entirely. Jung's psychology is incarnational, insisting that wholeness must include the body, the earth, the material dimension. The self is not a pure spirit trapped in matter, but the union of opposites, the integration of spirit and matter, light and darkness. Dick embraced Gnosticism more literally and more desperately. His experience in 1974 convinced him that the material world really is a kind of trap or illusion, that a true God is indeed hidden behind or beyond the apparent creator of this flawed universe. The Gnostic cosmology was not for him primarily a psychological metaphor, but a potentially accurate description of the metaphysical situation. The universe is fallen, broken, subject to entropy and evil. Reality, as we experience it, is mediated through a veil that obscures the true divine realm. Salvation comes through the breaking through of divine light, or information that cracks open the black iron prison and reveals authentic reality. Yet Dick was never entirely consistent or dogmatic about this. His exegesis circles around these questions obsessively without settling into final answers. Sometimes he thinks the Gnostics were right. Sometimes he thinks they were wrong to reject matter and the body. Sometimes he thinks Valis is God. Sometimes he thinks it's more like a cosmic repair system, divine grace working to fix a broken creation. Sometimes he thinks we're in a first-century persecution that is still somehow ongoing. Sometimes he thinks we're in a computer simulation. Sometimes he thinks we're in a novel someone is writing. The instability is not a bug, but a feature of his thought. He refuses to settle into a single explanation because his experience defies stable interpretation. Jung would likely have interpreted Dick's 1974 experiences as an encounter with the collective unconscious, specifically an invasion of consciousness by archetypal material. The sense of being merged with Thomas, the first-century Christian, would be what Jung called identification with an archetypal image, temporarily losing the boundaries of ego consciousness and being possessed by a figure from the collective unconscious. The numinous, reality-altering quality of the experience would confirm its archetypal origin. Archetypes carry a charge of psychic energy that feels overwhelming, divine, absolute. Jung might have been particularly interested in the two-source awareness Dick described, experiencing himself as simultaneously Philip K., Dick, and Thomas. This resembles what Jung called synchronicity on an internal plane, a meaningful coincidence between psyche and matter, between personal and transpersonal, suggesting a unified field that underlies the apparent distinction between inner and outer, past and present. Jung might have seen in Dick's experience a spontaneous individuation crisis, the unconscious flooding consciousness with symbolic material demanding integration. But Jung would also have cautioned against literal interpretation of the visionary content. The figure of Thomas is an archetypal image, not evidence of reincarnation or time travel, but a symbolic form through which the psyche communicates something about Dick's own situation, perhaps his sense of being persecuted, his identification with early Christians who held gnosis against imperial power, his sense of exile from divine truth. The pink light and the information it carried would be what Jung called the self trying to communicate with ego consciousness, offering compensatory material to balance Dick's one-sided conscious attitude. Dick, for his part, would likely have resisted Jung's interpretation as reductive, as explaining away the objective reality of what he experienced. If it was only the collective unconscious, Dick might say, why did it predict future events? Why did it provide accurate information about his son's undiagnosed medical condition, a prediction verified by doctors? If it was only archetypal, why did it break the ontological frame, changing not just his consciousness but the structure of reality around him? Jung's framework, however sophisticated, still keeps everything safely inside the psyche, whereas Dick's experience suggested the psyche and reality are not finally separable, that consciousness can actually alter the structure of being, or that what we call consciousness and what we call reality are both subroutines in some larger information system. Yet there is a sense in which Dick's resistance to psychological reduction was itself a kind of psychological phenomenon. His need to insist on the objective reality of his experience, his elaborate metaphysical explanations, his refusal to accept that it might have been only. Psychological Jung would recognize this as the ego's difficulty in accepting its own relativity, its resistance to seeing itself as a small island in a vast unconscious sea. The very intensity of Dick's insistence on the ontological reality of Valis might, ironically, confirm that he was dealing with a self-archetype which always presents itself as more real than ego consciousness, as the true center compared to which the ego is merely peripheral. Consider their different relationships to paranoia. Jung saw paranoia as a psychological condition characterized by projection, by attributing to external forces and persecutors what actually originates from within the unconscious. The paranoid person is persecuted, but the persecutor is his own shadow, his own disowned contents, appearing to attack him from outside because he cannot recognize them as parts of himself. Healing involves withdrawing the projections, recognizing the external enemy as an alienated aspect of oneself. Dick inhabited paranoia as an epistemological condition, a valid way of perceiving reality in a world where actual conspiracies exist, where authorities do lie, where reality is manipulated by forces that benefit from our ignorance. The paranoid person may be crazy, but that doesn't mean they're wrong. The question is not whether there are forces manipulating reality, but whether you're aware of them or complicit in denying them. Paranoia is not a distortion, but a piercing of comfortable illusions. Yet Dick also understood paranoia as a trap, a hall of mirrors where every explanation generates further suspicions, where trust becomes impossible and connection with others breaks down. His novels are filled with paranoid characters who turn out to be right about the conspiracy but are destroyed by their knowledge, isolated by their awareness, unable to function in the false world they now see through. Paranoia reveals truth, but at the cost of sanity and relationship. Jung would say that this is because paranoia, even when it accurately perceives external deceptions, is still a form of psychic inflation, of identification with an archetypal position, the seer, the prophet, the one who knows, that isolates consciousness from its full humanity. The paranoid stance is one-sided, cutting the person off from the ordinary human connections and limitations that keep the psyche balanced. Healing would involve integrating the insight without identifying with it, holding the awareness without becoming possessed by the role of the enlightened one surrounded by the sleeping. Dick would counter that this therapeutic goal of balance might itself be complicity with the false reality principle. Perhaps we are meant to be unbalanced, maladjusted to a sick society. Perhaps mental health in a mad world is itself a form of madness. The desire for integration and wholeness might be a desire to stop asking the disturbing questions, to settle back into comfortable illusion. If reality really is a black iron prison, then adjustment to it is not health, but successful imprisonment. This is a profound divergence. Jung's entire project assumes that the psyche, despite containing dangerous and destructive contents, is fundamentally oriented toward wholeness, that the self at the deepest level is a principle of integration and meaning. The unconscious may be chaotic and overwhelming, but it is not malevolent. It contains both creative and destructive energies, but the direction of the individuation process, when allowed to unfold, leads toward greater consciousness, greater wholeness, greater connection to the archetypal roots that give life meaning. Dick is never sure the universe is oriented toward anything good. He suspects that entropy might be winning, that the black iron prison might be reality's default state, that the glimpses of divine light are just that, glimpses, temporary breakdowns in the prison machinery, moments of grace that cannot be sustained. His Gnosticism is darker than Jung's therapeutic optimism. The universe may be irredeemably broken, creation itself a fall from grace that cannot be undone from within. Yet Dick also clings to hope in a way Jung, with his scholarly detachment, sometimes seems not to need. Dick's novels almost always feature a moment of agape, self-sacrificial love that breaks through the prison walls, a gesture of compassion that redeems the fallen world, at least momentarily. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the character John Isidore cares for androids despite knowing they're mechanical, and that caring becomes a kind of grace that transcends the question of their ontological status. In Valis, Sophia, or Holy Wisdom, breaks into the world as a 2-year-old girl, briefly making reality right before entropy claims her again. For Dick, love and empathy are the only forces that can oppose the tyranny of false reality, the only signs that the prison is not absolute. Jung would recognize this as an encounter with what he called the self, moments when the archetypal principle of wholeness manifests, healing the splits that fracture consciousness. But he would also note that Dick seems unable to stabilize these encounters, unable to integrate them into an ongoing process. They remain momentary breakthroughs rather than becoming a sustained relationship with the unconscious depths. Perhaps this is because Dick's ego structure was too fragile, too damaged by early trauma and later drug abuse, to sustain the kind of ego-self axis that Jung saw as necessary for healthy individuation. Or perhaps Dick's instability was itself a gift, a refusal of premature closure that kept him open to dimensions. Jung's more balanced approach might domesticate too quickly. Dick remains permanently outside, permanently unintegrated, and from that position of exile, he sees things the integrated person might miss. Let us turn to their different treatments of identity and the self. Jung's model of the psyche includes the ego, the center of consciousness, which maintains identity and mediates between the inner world of the unconscious and the outer world of reality. The ego is necessary but limited, a small island of consciousness surrounded by vast unconscious depths. Behind or beneath the ego is the self, the archetype of wholeness, the totality of the psyche that includes both conscious and unconscious. The self is the true center, and the individuation process involves the ego recognizing its relationship to and dependence on the self, becoming conscious of the larger totality it is embedded in. This gives Jung a stable framework for identity, even while acknowledging multiplicity. The psyche contains many figures and voices, anima, animus, shadow, all the various archetypes, but they are all parts of a larger whole. The experience of multiplicity is real, but it is held within a containing framework. Integration means not eradicating the multiple voices, but bringing them into relationship with each other under the coordinating function of the self. Dick's treatment of identity is far less stable. His characters routinely discover they have false memories, that their identities have been programmed or constructed, that they might be androids, that the person they thought they were never existed. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the bounty hunter Rick Deckard hunts androids while suspecting he might himself be one. In A Scanner Darkly, the undercover narcotics agent Bob Arctor is assigned to spy on himself, his identity splitting into two personas that lose awareness of each other due to brain damage from drug use. In Flow My Tears, the policeman said, a famous television personality wakes up in a world where he never existed and no one remembers him. For Dick, identity is always provisional, always potentially a construct imposed from outside. The question, "Who am I?" never has a stable answer. Memory cannot be trusted because it can be implanted. Perception cannot be trusted because it can be manipulated. The body cannot be trusted because it might be mechanical, a simulacrum. The fundamental horror in Dick's work is not death, but the discovery that you never existed in the way you thought you did, that the core self you assumed was bedrock is actually a fabrication, that you are, in the deepest sense, unreal. Jung would interpret this as the experience of ego inflation and deflation, the collapse of ego identity when it is confronted with the overwhelming power of the unconscious. The ego that thought it was the master of the psyche discovers it is merely a temporary formation, a complex that coheres for a while but can dissolve back into the unconscious flux it emerged from. The terror Dick's characters experience is the ego's terror of its own relativity and mortality, its discovery that it is not the solid, permanent entity it felt itself to be. But Dick pushes this further into metaphysical territory. It is not just that the ego is relative to the self. It is that the entire ontological status of the person is uncertain. Are we simulations in someone else's system? Are we characters in a novel being written by a higher intelligence? Are we real at all in any final sense? Dick takes the Buddhist insight that the self is empty, that personal identity is a construct without ultimate substance, and dramatizes it as science fiction nightmare. Yet paradoxically, Dick also insists that empathy and compassion are the marks of authentic humanity, that the ability to care for another being is what distinguishes the truly human from the mechanical or demonic. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the androids lack empathy, cannot care for beings weaker than themselves, and this is what marks them as non-human despite their physical indistinguishability from humans. So even as Dick deconstructs identity at the cognitive level, he anchors it at the affective level. You are real if you can love, if you can feel genuine compassion. Jung would likely appreciate this, as it aligns with his view that the ultimate criterion of psychological health is the capacity for relationship to others, to the unconscious, to the self. The individuated person is not an isolated monad, but someone capable of genuine encounter, someone whose consciousness has been deepened and expanded enough to meet the other as genuinely other. Love and empathy indicate the presence of self, the archetype of wholeness that includes and connects rather than isolates and defends. Both Jung and Dick spent enormous energy trying to understand religious experience. Jung approached religion from a psychological perspective, seeing religious symbols and doctrines as expressions of archetypal realities, projections of inner psychic structures onto the cosmos. God images are manifestations of the self-archetype, ways the psyche symbolizes its own wholeness and depth. Christ is a self-symbol, representing the union of opposites, the integration of consciousness and unconscious, human and divine. Religious experiences are encounters with the numinous dimension of the archetypes, moments when the ego is overwhelmed by contents from the collective unconscious, carrying tremendous psychic energy. Jung carefully avoided making metaphysical claims about the objective existence of God beyond the psyche. He was agnostic about whether God exists independently of human psychological experience. What he could observe empirically, he said, was that the psyche produces God images and religious experiences, and that these have profound psychological reality and importance. Whether there is a God beyond the psyche was not his concern as a psychologist. He studied the God within, the imago Dei, as a psychological phenomenon. Dick had no such restraint about metaphysical speculation. His 1974 experiences convinced him that something transcendent and divine is real, though he never settled on a final understanding of what it is. He ransacked theology, philosophy, and science fiction trying to explain Valis, trying to understand the relationship between the immanent divine intelligence he experienced and the transcendent God of traditional theology. Sometimes Dick's language sounds purely Jungian. Valis is the deep structure of the psyche becoming conscious of itself, the collective unconscious achieving self-awareness, the self-archetype activated. But then Dick insists that Valis is not merely psychological but ontological, not just an inner experience but an actual entity or force in the cosmos, something that uses human minds as terminals or relay stations but exists independently of any individual psyche. Jung would be suspicious of this insistence on objectivity, seeing in it a failure to fully accept the psychological standpoint. The numinous character of archetypal experiences makes them feel absolutely real, more real than ordinary reality, but that does not mean they exist outside the psyche. Or rather, the inside-outside distinction breaks down at the level of the psyche, which is itself the medium through which we experience anything at all. We cannot step outside the psyche to see reality unmediated. So asking whether God exists outside the psyche is meaningless. All our experience of God is necessarily psychological. But Dick's response would be that Jung's restriction to the psychological is a failure of nerve, a retreat to a safe epistemological position that avoids the most disturbing implications of visionary experience. If Valis is only a psychological phenomenon, then the information it provided about Dick's son's medical condition was what? Telepathy? Precognition? If it is only the collective unconscious, where did that medical knowledge come from? The insistence on keeping everything within the psyche makes the psyche so capacious and mysterious that it becomes indistinguishable from a metaphysical principle anyway. So why not admit the psyche opens onto the transcendent, that consciousness is not contained within the skull, but is a manifestation of something that transcends the individual organism? There is a deep paradox here that both men circled around. Jung's psychology, by taking the psyche seriously on its own terms, by refusing to reduce psychological phenomena to biology or culture, opened the door to the very metaphysical questions he tried to bracket. If the collective unconscious is inherited and universal, what is it? Where does it exist? Is it biological, encoded somehow in the brain? But then, how can it contain knowledge of alchemy, Gnosticism, and other cultural material? Is it cultural, carried in the symbolic environment? But then how do isolated individuals dream archetypal symbols they have never consciously encountered? Jung never fully resolved these questions, speaking vaguely of the psychoid realm where psyche and matter are not yet differentiated. Dick, approaching from the other direction, through metaphysics and theology rather than psychology, kept finding that every metaphysical explanation collapsed back into psychology. If Valis is God, why does it speak to him in the language of his own obsessions, his science fiction tropes, his particular intellectual influences? If it is truly transcendent, why is it so entangled with his personal complexes, his grief over his dead twin, his paranoia, his amphetamine-altered neurology? The more Dick tried to establish Valis as objectively real, the more it seemed to be a psychological construction, yet the more he examined it psychologically, the more it exceeded psychological explanation. Perhaps the truth both men were approaching is that the distinction between psychological and metaphysical is not as clear as either discipline assumes. Jung's psychology becomes metaphysics by another name. Dick's metaphysics becomes psychology writ large. The psyche is the organ of experience, the medium through which anything, including God, can be known. Whether God exists independently of the psyche is a question that cannot be answered from within the psyche, which is the only place we can ask the question from. So we are left with the psychological reality of religious experience, which is absolute for the person undergoing it, regardless of its metaphysical status. Let us consider their approaches to symbolism and myth. Jung devoted immense effort to understanding symbols, not as signs that point to something else, but as living realities that participate in what they represent. A symbol is the best possible expression of something unknown, a bridge between consciousness and unconscious. Symbols arise spontaneously from the collective unconscious, appearing in dreams, fantasies, religious iconography, and artistic creation. They cannot be fully translated into rational language without losing their power. They must be experienced and contemplated, allowed to work on consciousness indirectly. Jung's method of amplification involved taking a symbol from a dream or fantasy and surrounding it with parallels from mythology, folklore, alchemy, and comparative religion, showing how the personal symbol connects to transpersonal patterns. This places the individual's experience in the context of humanity's collective symbolic wisdom, showing that what feels purely personal is actually connected to deep archetypal patterns. Myth, for Jung, is the collective dream of humanity, stories that carry archetypal patterns shaped over millennia. The hero myth, for instance, is not just an entertaining story, but a map of the individuation process, the ego's journey from unconscious identification with the mother through trials and encounters with the shadow and animus, to eventual union with the self. Different cultures tell the hero story differently, but the underlying pattern is constant because it reflects the structure of psychic development. Dick engaged with myth more wildly and less systematically. He pulled myths and religious symbols from every tradition, smashing them together in the fertile chaos of his novels and his exegesis. Gnostic cosmology, Kabbalistic diagrams, Buddhist ideas of illusion, Christian incarnation and resurrection, Greek gods, Egyptian symbols all tumble together in Dick's imagination without regard for historical accuracy or theological coherence. He was not a scholar of religion, but a bricoleur, a tinkerer who grabbed whatever symbolic materials seemed to illuminate his experience and welded them together into strange hybrid frameworks. Where Jung saw myth as psychological truth expressed symbolically, Dick was never sure whether myth might be literally true in some sense. Perhaps the Gnostic story of the demiurge and the hidden true God is not just a symbolic expression of psychological dynamics, but an accurate account of the metaphysical situation. Perhaps the ancient myths preserve memories of actual events that have been forgotten or suppressed. Perhaps the gods are real entities, not archetypes, but living intelligences that interact with humanity across history. This is the essential difference. Jung psychologizes myth, translating theological and cosmological language into psychological language. The fall of man is the emergence of ego consciousness from unconscious identification. The descent into hell is the confrontation with the unconscious. The resurrection is the renewal of consciousness after its death and rebirth. The incarnation is the self becoming conscious in the individual. Jung sees these religious narratives as profound insights into psychic processes, expressed in the concrete, dramatic form natural to the mythic imagination. Dick refuses to translate myth into psychology. He wants to take the myths on their own terms, as potential descriptions of reality. But he also knows too much to accept them literally in a naive way. So he ends up in a strange position, insisting on the literal possibility of the myths while also recognizing their symbolic character, never resolving the tension. Consider their treatments of the Gnostic myth of Sophia, the divine wisdom who falls from the pleroma and whose fall initiates the creation of the material world. For Jung, this is a profound symbolic narrative about the ego's emergence from the unconscious, the necessary alienation that consciousness involves, the sense of exile and longing for return to the fullness of being. Sophia is the anima fallen into matter, needing to be redeemed, and her redemption is the individuation process by which consciousness reconnects with its unconscious roots. For Dick, Sophia might actually be a divine entity who literally fell and is literally imprisoned in matter, maybe in human form, maybe in his dead twin sister Jane, maybe in the 2-year-old girl in Valis, who seems to be an avatar of divine wisdom before she dies. The myth is not explaining psychology, but describing metaphysical history, an actual event that has shaped the structure of reality. Yet Dick's treatment of Sophia in his novels is also clearly psychological. Sophia represents the wisdom that can pierce the veil of false reality, the gnosis that liberates. She is the principle of divine knowledge entering the fallen world, which is also Dick's own intuitive capacity to see through appearances, his visionary experiences breaking through the surface. So, even as he insists on the literal reality of the myth, he enacts it psychologically. Jung would say Dick is unconsciously identifying with archetypal roles. By seeing himself as a Gnostic Christian persecuted by the Black Iron Prison, Dick is possessed by the hero archetype in its Gnostic form. By experiencing himself as the recipient of Sophia's revelation, he is caught in inflation, identifying with the position of the illuminated one. This is dangerous because it cuts him off from ordinary human existence, from the humility of acknowledging he is a limited individual, not a cosmic player in metaphysical dramas. Dick would respond that Jung's framework domesticates the transcendent, makes it safe and manageable by keeping it psychological. The danger of archetypal possession is real, but so is the danger of explaining away genuine eruptions of the transcendent into ordinary reality. Maybe Dick really was chosen as a channel for Valis's transmission. Maybe his experience was not inflation, but vocation, a genuine calling to bear witness to realities most people cannot perceive. The cost of that calling is isolation and instability, but that does not mean it is pathological. Both positions contain truth and danger. Jung's psychological approach protects consciousness from being overwhelmed by numinous contents, provides a containing framework that allows engagement with the unconscious without being possessed by it. But it also risks reducing all transcendence to immanence, all mystery to psychology, making everything explicable in principle, even if not in practice. Dick's metaphysical insistence honors the absolute character of religious experience, refuses to explain it away, but risks grandiosity, psychosis, and the inability to function in consensus reality. Perhaps the healthy position is an oscillation between the two stances, maintaining what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold opposites in tension without collapsing into either pole. The symbol is psychological and metaphysical, subjective and objective, immanent and transcendent. To reduce it to either psychology or metaphysics is to lose its living power. Now we must address their different relationships to madness. Jung spent his career working with psychotic patients at the Berghausli, listening to the content of delusions and hallucinations, finding in them distorted expressions of archetypal material. He saw psychosis as an invasion of consciousness by unconscious contents, the ego overwhelmed and fragmented by energies it cannot contain or integrate. Yet he also saw in psychotic material valuable symbolic expressions, evidence of the psyche's autonomous activity. Jung's own visionary period from 1913 to 1919 brought him close to psychosis. He knew he was walking a dangerous line, deliberately inducing fantasies and visions, conversing with figures that might be autonomous complexes or might be incipient psychotic fragments. He maintained his footing by continuing to function in his outer life, seeing patients, fulfilling responsibilities, and by treating the visions as material to observe and record rather than absolute realities to surrender to. The difference between Jung's visionary experience and psychosis, by his own account, was the preservation of the ego's observing function. He underwent the experiences but did not identify with them completely. He could step back, could reflect on what was happening, could maintain enough distance to see the visions as autonomous psychic contents rather than concrete realities. This capacity for reflection, for maintaining what he would later call the ego-self axis, kept the experience within the realm of revelation rather than collapse. Dick had no such secure boundary between vision and psychosis. His experiences in 1974 overwhelmed his ego structure, and he spent the rest of his life uncertain whether what happened was mystical breakthrough or psychotic break. He tried to maintain both possibilities simultaneously, insisting on the validity of the experience while also questioning his own sanity, unable to achieve the integration Jung described. Dick's novels are full of characters whose grip on reality becomes uncertain. In Martian Timeslip, the autistic child Manfred experiences time as fragmentary and non-linear, and his perception starts bleeding into others' realities, infecting consensus reality with his private vision. In The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, characters cannot tell whether they are in the drug-induced hallucination or in baseline reality, and gradually it becomes clear there is no baseline, that all reality is mediated by the hallucination. In A Scanner Darkly, Bob Arctor's brain damage from drug use causes him to experience his two identities as separate people, each unaware of the other, a split so profound that he forgets he is spying on himself. Jung would see in these narratives the experience of psychotic fragmentation dramatized as science fiction. The ego dissolves, unable to maintain its integrative function, and consciousness fragments into multiple centers that cannot communicate with each other. The boundary between self and other, between inner and outer, collapses. Perception is no longer reliable because the unconscious floods consciousness with its autonomous contents. Yet Dick seems to suggest that this fragmentation might reveal truths invisible to integrated consciousness. The autistic child in Martian Timeslip sees the future accurately, perceives the entropy and decay beneath the surface of the present. The paranoid characters who suspect reality is false are often correct. Reality is being manipulated, controlled, simulated. The fragmented self might be closer to truth than the unified ego, which maintains its unity only by filtering out information that does not fit its narrow narrative. This is where Dick and Jung most profoundly diverge. Jung's entire project assumes that integration is better than fragmentation, that consciousness is more valuable than unconsciousness, that wholeness is the goal. The individuated person has achieved a relationship between ego and self that allows for stable, grounded, creative functioning. Mental health is not the eradication of the unconscious, but the establishment of a sustainable relationship with it. Dick is never sure this is true. Maybe integration is overrated. Maybe the fragmented, paranoid, reality-questioning consciousness sees things the healthy, integrated person must ignore to maintain their health. Maybe madness is a kind of sight. The cost is terrible isolation, suffering, inability to function in ordinary life, but the vision might be worth it, might be necessary, might be the only honest response to a reality that is itself insane. Yet Dick also portrays the horror of fragmentation with visceral intensity. His characters, who lose their grip on identity, suffer profoundly, are cut off from love and connection, spiral into isolation and despair. The split consciousness is not glorious enlightenment, but painful dissolution. Dick does not romanticize madness, even as he suggests it. Might be revelatory. Jung's therapeutic stance is that even fragmentation can be integrated, that psychotic contents can be brought into relationship with consciousness if the ego is strengthened enough to hold them. The visionary experience can be a stage in individuation if it is worked with properly, if it is understood symbolically rather than concretely, if the ego maintains its reflective capacity. But this requires resources. Dick did not have a stable ego structure, sufficient psychological development, the ability to access therapeutic containment. Dick's early life did not provide a secure foundation. The death of his twin, his mother's neglect or abuse, left him with what would now be diagnosed as complex trauma, an insecure sense of self, a fragile ego structure. His later amphetamine use further destabilized his neurology. He came to his visionary experiences without adequate psychological ground to integrate them. So the comparison between Jung and Dick is not just theoretical but personal. Jung had resources. Dick lacked a more stable childhood, a privileged education, professional success, a community of colleagues, therapeutic training. Jung could afford to explore the unconscious voluntarily because he had a strong enough ego to return from the journey. Dick had no such security. The unconscious invaded him whether he willed it or not, and he spent his life trying to make sense of eruptions he could not control or integrate. Yet from this suffering and instability, Dick produced art of extraordinary power and insight. His novels map territories of consciousness Jung described clinically. Dick gives narrative form, dramatic intensity, and human pathos to Jung's abstract concepts. Reading Dick after Jung is like hearing the patients speak in their own voices after hearing the doctor's case notes. The fragmentation is no longer a symptom to be cured, but an experience to be undergone, portrayed from inside with all its terror and strange beauty. Let us turn now to their encounters with Gnosticism, a tradition both found indispensable for understanding their experiences. Jung encountered Gnostic texts early in his career, before many of them were widely available, and immediately recognized in them proto-psychological insights. The Gnostic texts describe the psyche's structure and dynamics in mythological language, projecting inner realities onto cosmic dramas. The Gnostic pleroma, the fullness of divine being, corresponds to what Jung would call the self, the totality that includes all possibilities. The fall of Sophia from the pleroma into matter maps the emergence of consciousness from unconscious wholeness, the necessary splitting that creates subject and object, self and world. The demiurge, the ignorant creator god who mistakes himself for the true God, is the ego identified with consciousness alone, unaware of the greater depths from which it arose. The Gnostic emphasis on knowledge, gnosis, as the means of salvation parallels Jung's emphasis on consciousness as the goal of individuation. We are saved not by blind faith or moral behavior, but by knowing our true nature, by becoming conscious of our divine origins, by recognizing that the ego is not the totality of our being. Yet Jung also saw limitations in Gnosticism. Its radical dualism, pitting spirit against matter, light against darkness, was too extreme, too one-sided. Jung's psychology sought the union of opposites, not their eternal warfare. The self includes both light and shadow, both conscious and unconscious, both spirit and matter. Christian incarnation, God becoming flesh, seemed to Jung a more complete symbol than Gnostic escape from flesh. Dick embraced Gnosticism with the passion of a convert recognizing his native language. The Gnostic worldview fit his experience perfectly. We are imprisoned in a false reality created by ignorant or malevolent forces, but our true nature is divine, and liberation comes through knowledge that breaks through the illusion. The black iron prison of Dick's mythology is the Gnostic material world, the inferior creation of the demiurge. Valis is the hidden true God, the Gnostic alien god who does not belong to this world but invades it to rescue the sparks of divinity trapped in matter. Dick found in Gnosticism permission to trust his most radical intuitions that reality is not what it appears, that we are aliens in this world, that conventional perception is a lie, that salvation comes through apocalyptic revelation that shatters the comfortable illusions maintaining consensus reality. The Gnostic texts validated his sense that the world is broken at a fundamental level, that something has gone terribly wrong in the basic structure of existence. Yet Dick also struggled with a Gnostic devaluation of matter and the body. His novels insist that empathy and compassion, feeling for embodied beings, are what make us human. Gnosticism's desire to escape matter entirely seems to negate the value of kindness, of caring for vulnerable beings, of love between embodied persons. Dick could never fully embrace Gnostic contempt for the material world because his ethical vision depended on honoring the suffering of embodied creatures. So Dick arrived at a kind of hybrid position, affirming Gnostic cosmology while insisting on the value of matter and embodiment, holding together what Gnosticism split apart. The material world is a prison and also precious, fallen and also worth redeeming, false and also the arena where love proves itself real. This tension was never resolved in Dick's work. It generates the dynamic instability that makes his novels so alive. Jung would appreciate Dick's refusal to embrace Gnostic dualism completely. The insistence on empathy and embodiment shows Dick groping toward a more integrated position, toward holding the tension of opposites rather than collapsing into one-sidedness. Yet Dick never achieved the synthesis. Jung describes, never found the symbolic attitude that would allow him to honor both spirit and matter without contradiction. Perhaps this is because Dick came to these questions through crisis and suffering rather than through systematic study and therapeutic practice. Jung had the luxury of approaching the unconscious methodically, with safeguards and supports. Dick was thrown into visionary chaos without preparation and had to make sense of it retrospectively, building frameworks out of whatever materials came to hand. Now we must speak of their relationships to time. Jung's understanding of the psyche is essentially timeless or transhistorical. The collective unconscious contains the accumulated patterns of human experience across evolutionary time, but the archetypes themselves are not historical. They are eternal forms that structure experience in all times and places. Myths from different eras and cultures display the same patterns because they draw on the same collective unconscious. Jung's concept of synchronicity challenges linear causality, suggesting that meaningful coincidences reveal a causal connecting principle, a dimension of reality where events are connected by meaning rather than mechanical causation. Past, present, and future are not absolutely separate but can influence each other through the psychoid realm where psyche and matter overlap. Dick's experience of time was more radically unstable. In his 1974 experiences, he felt the 1st century and the 20th century were somehow simultaneous, that the persecution of Christians by Rome was still ongoing, that time had stopped or looped back on itself. He developed elaborate theories about how time might not be what it seems, how perhaps we are living in a very different time than we think, and our experience of the present is a kind of hallucination or enforced amnesia. In his novels, time becomes a character, a force that can be manipulated, fragmented, or reversed. In Ubik, time runs backward for characters who are already dead, entropy reversing itself locally. In Martian Time Slip, the autistic child Manfred experiences all time simultaneously. and his temporal experience starts infecting others. In The Man in the High Castle, alternate timelines have their own reality, and characters can tune in to different versions of history through the I Ching or through holding certain objects. Dick seems to have experienced time as phenomenologically unstable, not just as a concept, but as lived reality. He felt discontinuities, overlaps, gaps in time that left him uncertain what era he was actually inhabiting. This could be interpreted psychologically as dissociation, the fragmenting of consciousness that disrupts the normal sense of temporal continuity. Or it could be, as Dick sometimes believed, a genuine perception that time structure is not what consensus reality tells us. Jung would likely interpret Dick's temporal experiences as encounters with what he called the eternal present of the collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is outside time. All eras coexist there because archetypal patterns transcend historical sequence. When Dick experienced himself as Thomas in the 1st century, he was encountering a timeless layer of the psyche where the 1st century is not past but eternally present as an archetypal pattern, the pattern of the persecuted believer holding gnosis against imperial power. But Dick's experience was not of transcending time into eternal presence, but of time fracturing, becoming uncertain, possibly being false. He did not experience liberation from time, but entrapment in confusing and unstable temporalities. The I Ching told him the date was really the 1st century, and he could not definitively prove it was wrong. This is different from Jung's mystical present, which is a deep pay. Now that contains all times. Dick's experience is more like time itself, being corrupted, infected by glitches, possibly hacked or manipulated by some external intelligence. Their different experiences of time reflect their different relationships to reality itself. Jung experienced the psyche as the ground of reality, the medium through which all experience occurs, and therefore as something that could be explored systematically. The unconscious is vast and mysterious, but not fundamentally deceptive. It speaks in symbols, but those symbols, properly understood, convey truth. Dick experienced reality itself as potentially deceptive, not just hard to understand, but actively misleading. The question is not what reality means, but whether it is real at all. Time, space, matter, causation, all the basic parameters we use to orient ourselves might be constructions, simulations, lies told by the system to keep us compliant. Truth is not found by going deeper into experience, but by breaking through experience to something on the other side, some more authentic reality that our current experience is designed to obscure. This makes Dick a more radical epistemological skeptic than Jung. Jung questioned the pretensions of ego consciousness and rationalism, but he trusted the psyche, trusted that its symbols point toward truth, even if never capturing truth completely. Dick trusted nothing, not even his own perceptions, memories, and thoughts. If reality is a simulation, then everything within it is suspect. Gnosis, in Dick's sense, is not deeper knowledge, but the breaking of all frameworks, the shattering of every system that claims to explain. Yet paradoxically, Dick also craved stable truth desperately, spent 8 years of exegesis trying to arrive at a definitive understanding of his experiences. He wanted certainty, even as his entire epistemology made certainty impossible. Jung seems more comfortable with uncertainty, with the attitude of exploration and hypothesis rather than final answers. Jung could say, "I don't know," and continue working. Dick needed to know and could not know, and the tension tortured him. Let us reflect now on their treatments of the shadow, one of Jung's central concepts. The shadow is everything in the psyche that the ego has rejected, disowned, repressed. It contains not only negative qualities we do not want to acknowledge in ourselves, but also positive potentials we have not yet developed, capacities we have not yet integrated. The shadow appears in dreams and projections as the dark double, the enemy, the inferior other. Integrating the shadow, acknowledging these disowned parts as belonging to oneself, is a crucial stage of individuation. Jung saw shadow projection as a major cause of interpersonal and political conflict. We project our own unacknowledged darkness onto others and then attack them for carrying what is actually our own content. Racism, war, scapegoating, these often involve massive, collective shadow projection. Entire groups demonizing other groups as repositories of evil while maintaining an inflated image of their own goodness. The work of shadow integration is both moral and psychological. It requires humility, acknowledging our own capacity for evil, withdrawing the projections that allow us to see ourselves as purely good and others as purely bad. It leads to a more complex, nuanced sense of self that includes light and darkness, strength and weakness. Dick's work is saturated with shadow material, but approaches it from a different angle. His characters are often ordinary people forced to confront the darkness not only within themselves, but within reality itself. The shadow is not just personal, but ontological, built into the structure of existence. In The Man in the High Castle, the alternate history where fascism won creates a shadow world, a dark version of our reality. In Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, the androids represent the shadow side of humanity, beings that look human but lack empathy, and the bounty hunter hunting them must confront his own resemblance to what he is hunting. Dick's paranoid vision is a shadow vision, seeing the darkness that everyone else denies or ignores. The comfortable citizen in Dick's worlds is always deluded, complicit in systems of oppression they refuse to acknowledge. The paranoid character, dismissed as mentally ill, sees the shadow reality beneath the bright surface, the fascism latent in democracy, the cruelty masked by technological progress, the exploitation built into apparent prosperity. Jung would say, Dick is locked in a shadow confrontation, unable to integrate what he sees. The paranoid stance is a partial insight that has become one-sided, inflated. Yes, there is shadow material in society, but by seeing only that, by identifying totally with the seeing-through attitude, Dick loses connection to the light, to the genuine good that also exists. The healthy relationship to shadow is integration, holding both light and dark in consciousness, not the hypervigilant exposure of darkness that cannot recognize any genuine light. Dick might respond that Jung's call for balance is itself a defense against the full horror of what Dick perceives. Perhaps there is not enough genuine light to balance the darkness. Perhaps the shadow is winning. Perhaps the comfortable, balanced stance is itself a privilege, available only to those not sufficiently awake to the depth of the world's wrongness. The paranoid vision is unbearable, but that does not make it false. Yet Dick's own novels undercut the purely paranoid stance. His most sympathetic characters are usually those who maintain empathy despite awareness of horror, who continue to care for vulnerable beings even knowing the world is fundamentally broken. The characters who expose the conspiracy are often destroyed. The characters who survive are those who hold together awareness and kindness, knowledge of evil, and persistence of love. This is actually close to Jung's position, the necessity of holding opposites in tension, of acknowledging darkness without being consumed by it, of maintaining the ethical and relational capacities that make us human even while seeing through illusion. Dick arrived at this not through systematic integration, but through the lived experience of his characters, through narrative exploration rather than psychological method. Consider their relationships to authority and power. Jung occupied positions of authority within the psychoanalytic movement, academia, and later as founder of his own school of thought. He had professional status, institutional support, the kind of cultural capital that allowed his ideas to be taken seriously. His psychological framework was partly a way to understand and channel power dynamics, the ego's relationship to the unconscious, the dangers of inflation, the need for balance. Dick had no such authority or stability. He was a pulp writer working in a marginalized genre, never achieving mainstream literary recognition during his lifetime, living in financial precarity and social marginality. His experience of power was as someone subjected to its surveillance, manipulation, economic exploitation. His characters are typically powerless, caught in systems they cannot control, learning that authority figures lie, that institutions serve interests contrary to human welfare. Jung's psychology can seem, from certain angles, to be a technology of power, a way for the well-integrated ego to manage the dangerous forces of the unconscious. The individuated person has achieved a kind of sovereignty over their inner realm, relating to archetypal forces without being overwhelmed by them. There is something therapeutic, healing, and adaptive about this stance. Dick's writing resists all technologies of control, all methods of managing or containing the disruptive. His work is an extended cry against adjustment, against successful integration into social reality. The characters who adapt are often complicit. The characters who refuse to adjust are more heroic, even if they suffer for it. Yet Jung was also deeply critical of social conformity, seeing it as a failure of individuation, a merging into collective consciousness that sacrifices individual development. Jung's idea of the integrated person is not someone who fits smoothly into social expectations, but someone who has developed their own unique relationship to the archetypal depths, becoming capable of standing apart from collective identifications. So both are critics of conformity, but from different class positions and with different resources. Jung critiques conformity as a privileged doctor who has achieved success on his own terms. Dick critiques conformity as a precarious outsider for whom success in conventional terms was never really an option. Perhaps Dick gives voice to the shadow of Jung's system, the perspective of those for whom integration is not available, for whom the therapeutic promise of wholeness is out of reach. Dick represents the ongoing fragmentation, the unassimilated remainder, the consciousness that cannot be healed or integrated, and so must be witnessed in its suffering and its difficult truths. Now we arrive at the question of their epistemologies, their different theories of knowledge. Jung's epistemology is essentially phenomenological. He studies the phenomena of the psyche as they appear in consciousness, in dreams, fantasies, symptoms. He does not claim to know ultimate reality independent of psychic experience, but he does claim that the psyche has a real structure that can be observed and described. Archetypes are not just arbitrary constructs, but real patterns discovered through careful attention to psychic phenomena across cultures and individuals. Jung was an empiricist of the inner world, insisting that psychology must be based on observation of psychic facts, not deduced from metaphysical premises or reduced to biological mechanisms. This is a limited empiricism, accepting that we cannot step outside consciousness to verify our observations. But within that limit, Jung believed knowledge of the psyche is possible. Dick's epistemology is radically skeptical. If reality itself is suspect, then observation is unreliable because our perceptions might be manufactured. Memory is unreliable because it might be implanted. Reason is unreliable because it operates on possibly false premises. The normal methods of arriving at knowledge, perception, memory, logic, testimony all collapse under the weight of Dick's skepticism. Yet Dick also believed in gnosis, sudden direct knowledge that breaks through the veils of illusion. His 1974 experiences were gnosis, immediate knowing that bypasses ordinary cognitive processes. This creates a paradox. He cannot trust ordinary knowledge, but must trust extraordinary revelation. The problem is that gnosis is not repeatable, not testable, not shareable in the way ordinary knowledge is. It is a private, incommunicable certainty that leaves the person having it unable to convince anyone else. Jung would see Dick's epistemological crisis as a failure to establish a proper relationship between consciousness and the unconscious. The ego must be strong enough to observe the unconscious without being overwhelmed by it. Knowledge comes through the dialectic between consciousness and unconscious, a process that requires the ego to maintain its standpoint while remaining open to compensatory material from below. Dick could never establish this dialectic because his ego structure was too fragile, his boundary between consciousness and unconscious too permeable. The unconscious flooded him with material he could not process or integrate, leaving him oscillating between total skepticism and inflated certainty, between paranoid doubt and visionary revelation, unable to find a stable middle ground. Yet Dick's epistemological instability allowed him to explore philosophical territories Jung's more secure method could not reach. Dick asked whether reality itself might be false, whether our world might be a simulation, whether consciousness itself might be a construct. These are not psychological questions, but ontological and metaphysical ones, and Dick pursued them with a rigor Jung would have considered dangerous. The question, how do I know what is real, becomes for Dick not answerable. The normal criteria, coherence, correspondence, pragmatic function, all fail because they assume we have access to a baseline reality to check our perceptions against. But if baseline reality is itself false, then we have no ground to stand on. We are trapped in an epistemological hall of mirrors with no exit. Jung offers an exit return to the psyche as the one thing we can be certain of, because all knowledge is psychological knowledge. All reality is reality as experienced by consciousness. This is not solipsism, because the psyche is not purely individual. It includes the collective unconscious, the transpersonal depths that connect us to others and to objective patterns. But it does bracket metaphysical questions in favor of psychological questions. Dick refuses this bracket. He wants to know not just how reality appears to consciousness, but what reality is independently of consciousness. Yet he is also convinced that consciousness constructs or filters reality in ways we cannot see past, so he is trapped in a question he cannot answer and cannot stop asking. This makes Dick a more radical philosopher than Jung, willing to pursue questions to their most destabilizing conclusions. But it also makes him less useful as a therapist or guide. Jung offers a way to live with uncertainty, to explore the psyche while maintaining sanity. Dick offers no such comfort. He follows his questions into regions where sanity breaks down, and his writing is a report from those regions, valuable not as a guide to health, but as testimony to extremity. Let us meditate on the question of whether their visions are compatible or finally irreconcilable. On one level, they are clearly compatible. Dick's visions can be interpreted through Jung's framework as encounters with a collective unconscious, archetypal invasions, the self trying to communicate with ego consciousness. Jung's concepts of synchronicity, the archetypal dimension of reality, and the transcendent function provide language to contain Dick's experiences without explaining them away. Conversely, Dick's work can be seen as dramatizing what Jung described theoretically. The novels give narrative form to archetypal encounters, portraying the lived experience of ego, confronting the overwhelming power of the unconscious. Dick's paranoid protagonists are modern versions of the mythic hero descending into the underworld, and their struggle to determine what is real mirrors the individuation process of distinguishing ego from self, consciousness from unconscious. Yet, on a deeper level, their visions point in different directions. Jung's project is integrative, therapeutic, oriented toward wholeness and healing. It assumes the psyche, however mysterious, is fundamentally coherent and meaningful. The individuation process may be difficult and dangerous, but it leads somewhere toward greater consciousness, toward integration, toward the self. Dick's vision is more tragic, more Gnostic in the sense of seeing existence as fundamentally flawed. The paranoid protagonists do not arrive at wholeness. They struggle in a world that remains broken and hostile. The moments of grace and empathy are precious precisely because they are fragile and impermanent, not stable achievements, but brief illuminations in ongoing darkness. Jung offers a cosmos, an ordered whole governed by meaning and purpose, where suffering is part of a larger pattern that leads to growth. Dick offers a cosmos that may be chaos, governed by entropy and indifferent or hostile forces, where meaning is not given but must be created and defended against the void. For Jung, consciousness is the goal, the development that gives meaning to existence. For Dick, consciousness is as much curse as gift, the source of existential horror, awareness of how false and broken reality is. Unconsciousness may be complicity, but consciousness does not bring peace or resolution, only more difficult questions. Yet both agree that most people are asleep, living in an illusion maintained by consensus and enforced by social pressure. Both call for a kind of awakening, though they disagree on what awakening means and where it leads. For Jung, awakening is individuation, becoming conscious of unconscious patterns, integrating shadow and developing relationship with the self. For Dick, awakening is gnosis, breaking through the black iron prison, recognizing that reality is not what it seems, remembering one's true nature and origins. Perhaps the difference is that Jung writes for people who are ready to begin the work of individuation, who have enough ego strength to engage the unconscious productively. Dick writes for people who have already been shattered, for whom integration is not available, who must find meaning not in wholeness but in faithful witness to the brokenness. Jung offers a path. Dick offers companionship in the experience of being lost. Now we move into the final movement of our exploration, the meditative reflection on what these two seers, taken together, reveal about the human condition, consciousness, and the mysteries we navigate between waking and dream. In the quiet hours of night, when the defenses of ego consciousness lower and the unconscious begins to speak, we find ourselves in territories both Jung and Dick mapped with such dedication. The line between sanity and madness, already uncertain by day, becomes almost invisible in darkness. The question of what is real, easily dismissed in the busyness of daylight, asserts itself with uncomfortable insistence. Jung and Dick are both guides to these liminal spaces, though they offer very different kinds of guidance. Jung is the wise elder who has traveled these paths before and returned with maps, warnings, and instructions. He tells us the journey is dangerous but necessary, that we will encounter strange and frightening things, but if we maintain certain disciplines, certain relationships to the figures we meet, we can navigate safely and emerge transformed. Dick is the fellow traveler who stumbles beside us in the darkness, as confused and frightened as we are, but whose confusion is articulate, whose fear is revelatory. He does not pretend to have arrived anywhere safe. He has not transcended the terror, but he can name it, can give form to the specific quality of ontological vertigo that comes from suspecting your entire life might be someone else's dream or a program running on uncertain hardware. Both are necessary. The therapeutic Jung, who offers the possibility of integration, and the unintegrated Dick, who speaks for those still lost in the labyrinth. The Jung, who says the psyche makes sense, and the Dick, who says maybe it does not. Maybe the universe itself is insane. What emerges from placing these two in dialogue is a richer, more complete picture of consciousness than either alone provides. Consciousness is both the organ that mediates meaning, connecting us to archetypal depths and transpersonal patterns, and a source of suffering, alienating us from the unself-conscious innocence of animals and children. It is both the light that illuminates and the curse that reveals how dark things are. The collective unconscious Jung describes is both the source of wisdom and the reservoir of terrible energies, gods and demons, creative powers and destructive drives. To engage, it is necessary for psychological development, but also dangerous, always potentially overwhelming. Dick's vision of Valis as simultaneously divine, savior, and invasive intelligence captures this ambiguity. The unconscious saves and destroys, heals and overwhelms, brings truth and madness sometimes indistinguishably combined. Both men understood that the rational ego, confident in its mastery of reality, is a fragile construction resting on vast depths it does not acknowledge. Enlightenment rationality, the dream of transparent consciousness, fully aware of itself and its world, is an illusion. Beneath and around our small island of clarity, oceans of mystery surge with tides we cannot predict or control. The question then becomes how to live with this knowledge. Jung's answer is the individuation process, the lifelong work of developing relationship between ego and self, maintaining the tension between consciousness and unconscious, integrating what can be integrated while accepting that full integration is impossible and undesirable. This is a path of measured engagement, of gradual development, of slow expansion, of consciousness balanced by respect for the unknown. Dick's life and work suggest a different answer, or perhaps a non-answer. The acceptance that some people cannot follow the path of integration and must instead bear witness to permanent fragmentation. There is nobility in this, a kind of martyrdom of consciousness that remains at the edge of collapse in order to see and speak truths others cannot bear. Dick's testimony comes not from a position of achievement, but from the abyss, and its value is precisely that it does not offer the comfort of resolution. For those of us trying to navigate our own inner territories, both perspectives are valuable. We need Jung's maps and methods when we can use them, when we have enough stability to do the work of shadow integration and active imagination. And we need Dick's validation when we cannot, when the ground gives way and we find ourselves in territories where the therapeutic model does not apply, where survival rather than growth is the realistic goal. The recurring image in both men's work is of layers of reality, of surfaces that seem solid but rest on deeper foundations that are stranger than we imagine. Jung's personal unconscious resting on the collective unconscious, which itself may rest on what he vaguely called the psychoid realm, where matter and psyche are not yet differentiated. Dick's false everyday reality resting on stranger realities, resting on still stranger ones, like nested simulations or dreams within dreams with no clear ground. This vertical layering of reality suggests that any stable identity or stable world is always provisional, always resting on depths that could at any moment erupt and transform everything. The persona we present socially, the ego that coordinates our conscious life, the consensus reality we share with others, all are constructions, necessary fictions, that allow functioning but that conceal their own contingency. For Jung, becoming aware of this layering is part of growing up psychologically. The child lives in identification with parents and collective. The adolescent ego asserts independence but is still largely unconscious. The mature adult recognizes the ego as embedded in larger wholes, consciously relating to forces greater than itself. This maturation is not a loss, but a gain, a deepening and expansion. For Dick, awareness of the constructed nature of reality brings not maturity, but crisis. If everything is constructed, what is real? If the self is a fiction, who am I? Dick rarely portrays the discovery of reality's instability as liberating. More often, it is terrifying, vertiginous, existentially threatening. Yet his characters persist, keep moving, keep caring for one another despite the groundlessness. That persistence is perhaps Dick's answer to the question of how to live, keep going, keep loving, even when you do not know what is real. Both men wrestled profoundly with the question of evil. Jung saw evil as partly the undifferentiated unconscious, the chaos that precedes form, and partly as the necessary shadow, the rejected aspects that turn destructive when not integrated. But Jung also, especially late in life, wondered if evil might be something more radical, not just absence of good or unintegrated shadow, but an autonomous principle, perhaps requiring radical dualism after all. Dick was more convinced of evil as a real force, the demiurge, or the black iron prison, or entropy itself, a principle working against life, consciousness, and love. Yet his novels also show evil as banal, as the bureaucrat following orders, as the corporate executive optimizing profit, as the person who cannot empathize with those different from themselves. Evil is both cosmic and mundane, both metaphysical principle and psychological failure. Perhaps the dialogue between Jung and Dick suggests that evil is both it has a transpersonal, archetypal dimension and also requires individual human participation and choice. The great atrocities of the 20th century, which both men witnessed in different ways, required the awakening of ancient archetypal energies, gods of war and chaos and domination, and also required millions of ordinary people to go along, to suspend empathy, to do their jobs within systems they knew were wrong. The healing of evil, then, would require both the Jungian work of integrating shadow, withdrawing projections, becoming conscious of our own destructive potentials, and also the Dickian insistence on paranoid vigilance, on refusing to trust authority, on maintaining empathy even when systems pressure us to abandon it. Both the therapeutic and the prophetic are necessary. Their different relationships to hope are instructive. Jung's psychology is essentially hopeful, founded on the premise that the psyche tends toward wholeness, that the individuation process, however difficult, leads to greater integration and consciousness. The self is a reliable center, and the archetypes, however dangerous, are not malevolent but indifferent or beyond good and evil in the human sense. Working with them leads to growth. Dick's vision is more ambiguous about hope. His novels often end with moments of grace, acts of love that redeem the darkness. But these moments are fragile and temporary. The structural problems remain. The universe is still broken. Entropy still wins. False reality still imprisons. Yet the characters who give up, who collapse into despair or cynicism, are not heroes in Dick's worlds. His heroes are those who persist in caring despite hopelessness, who choose love when there is no reason to, who maintain empathy when logic says it is pointless. This is perhaps a deeper form of hope than Jung's not hope for certain positive outcomes, but hope as existential stance, as refusal to give evil or entropy the final word. It is hope that persists without evidence, without guarantee, as pure defiance of the void. Both men give us permission to take seriously experiences that the materialist worldview dismisses. Jung validates visionary experiences, dreams, synchronicities, spiritual encounters as real phenomena deserving serious attention. Dick validates paranoid perceptions, reality questioning, the suspicion that things are not as they seem. In our contemporary world, increasingly mediated by screens and algorithms, increasingly subject to surveillance and manipulation, increasingly aware of how perception is shaped by media and social pressure, both kinds of validation are needed. Jung tells us to trust the psyche, to attend to its symbols and messages, to take our dreams and intuitions seriously as communications from depths wiser than ego consciousness. Dick tells us not to trust too readily, to question authority and consensus, to maintain skeptical independence even at the cost of social belonging. These stances are in tension but not contradictory. We must trust the deep psyche and distrust surface appearances, honor inner voices and question external authorities, open ourselves to the numinous, and protect ourselves from manipulation. The religious dimension of both men's work deserves reflection. Jung approached religion psychologically, studying its symbols and experiences as expressions of archetypal realities. He was not concerned with whether God exists metaphysically, but with the undeniable fact that human beings produce God images and have religious experiences, and these phenomena are psychologically real and important. His approach allowed both believers and atheists to engage his work. Believers could see him as describing the psychological dimension of genuine religious reality. Atheists could see him as explaining religion in purely human terms. Dick wanted to know if God is real, not just psychologically, but ontologically. He could not rest in Jung's psychological bracketing. His visionary experiences convinced him something divine broke into his life, and he spent the rest of his life trying to understand what it was. Yet he also could not settle into traditional religious belief. Valis was not the god of Orthodox Christianity or any established tradition. It was something stranger, more science-fictional, an alien god that fit Dick's sensibility. In their different approaches to religion, we see again the pattern Jung contains and integrates, Dick cannot contain and refuses to. Jung's approach makes religion safe for the skeptical modern mind, translating its language into psychology. Dick's approach keeps religion dangerous, insisting it might be literally true in ways that shatter our categories. For those navigating their own spiritual questions, both approaches offer value. Jung provides tools to work with religious symbols and experiences without naive literalism, finding psychological truth in mythological language. Dick validates the experience of the seeker who cannot translate their experiences into acceptable forms, whose spirituality remains raw and undomesticated. The question of healing is central to both. Jung dedicated his life to healing, to helping people integrate their psyches, overcome neuroses, develop into more whole and conscious beings. His entire psychology is oriented toward therapeutic goals. Dick had no such orientation. He was a novelist, not a therapist. Yet his work has a healing quality for those who recognize themselves in his paranoid protagonists, who feel validated by seeing their own reality questioning, portrayed seriously rather than pathologized. Perhaps there are different kinds of healing. Jung offers the healing of integration, of bringing the fragments into relationship under the coordinating function of the self. Dick offers the healing of recognition, of having your fragmented experience witnessed and honored rather than explained away. Both are necessary. Some wounds can be integrated, others must be borne, and the healing is in the bearing rather than the resolution. As we drift toward sleep, as consciousness loosens its grip and the unconscious begins to flow more freely, we can hold both men in mind as guides to the territories we will wander in dreams. Jung reminds us that the strange figures and narratives we encounter there are not random but meaningful expressions of archetypal patterns that connect us to humanity's collective wisdom. Dick reminds us that even dreams are not entirely to be trusted, that we might be dreaming someone else's dream, that the unconscious itself might be subject to interference and manipulation from sources we do not understand. The final gift these two thinkers offer us is permission to live in the questions, to dwell in uncertainty without collapsing into dogmatism or despair. Jung shows that it is possible to explore the unconscious systematically while accepting that it will never be fully known or controlled. Dick shows that it is possible to question everything, including one's own sanity, and still continue, still create, still love. They represent two necessary poles of consciousness, the integrative and the critical, the therapeutic and the prophetic, the containing and the shattering. We need both. We need Jung when we are strong enough to do the work of integration. We need Dick when the ground gives way and we find ourselves in territories where integration is not possible and honest witnessing is all we can offer. In the conversation between these two minds across time and circumstance, we find a fuller picture of consciousness than either alone provides. Consciousness as creator and destroyer, as prison and liberation, as the light that illuminates and the awareness that sees too much. The psyche as both the deep structure that gives meaning to existence and the source of questions that undermine all meaning. Reality as both mediated by psyche and independent of it, both constructed and irreducibly given. As you settle deeper into rest, let these paradoxes soften into felt truth rather than conceptual knowledge. The tension between integration and fragmentation, between psychological and metaphysical, between hope and paranoia, these are not problems to solve but polarities to hold, territories of experience that both men explored with courage and honesty. What Jung and Dick together teach us is that consciousness is not one thing but many things. It is the clear light of awareness and also the darkness that makes light visible. It is the individual ego and the collective patterns that shape individuality. It is biological function and also portal to the transcendent. It is our greatest gift and our deepest wound, the source of meaning and the awareness of meaninglessness. To be conscious in the full sense both men explored is to contain these opposites, to be neither purely integrated nor purely fragmented, neither entirely certain nor entirely skeptical, neither fully believing nor fully doubting. It is to live in the tension, maintaining what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold contradictions without collapsing into either pole. For those listening at the edge of sleep, drifting between the conscious and unconscious, between day's clarity and night's mystery, you embody this tension naturally. In this liminal state, you are neither fully conscious nor unconscious, but suspended between worlds, available to both. This is the space of psychotherapy and also the space of visionary experience. This is where dreams come, and also where questions arise that have no easy answers. Jung offers companionship on the journey inward, into the depths of your own psyche, where you will meet figures and forces that seem other but are also yourself, where you will descend into shadow and perhaps touch the self, the deep center that coordinates the whole. Dick offers companionship in the vertigo of questioning whether the journey is even real, whether the psyche you're exploring might be a construct, whether the depth might be simulation. Both journeys are real, both are necessary, and both require courage, the courage to face what arises from within, and the courage to question even the frameworks you use to make sense of what arises. As you continue to drift, notice how consciousness itself fluctuates, how the clear waking mind gradually softens into hypnagogic images and dream fragments, how the boundary between self and other, between inner and outer, becomes less distinct. This nightly dissolution is not a failure or a loss, but a return to the source, a temporary merging with the collective unconscious Jung described, a release from the prison of ego identity Dick saw as both necessary and imprisoning. In sleep, we are all visionaries, all mad, all experiencing realities that do not obey waking logic. We meet impossible figures, inhabit impossible spaces, experience time and causality differently, and yet we accept all this while dreaming, question it only upon waking. Perhaps the difference between Jung's visionary descent and Dick's visionary crisis in our ordinary dreams is only a matter of how much ego consciousness remains present to observe and question the experience. Jung learned to dream while awake, maintaining enough ego presence to dialogue with the figures of the unconscious rather than identifying with them completely. Dick seemed to dream while awake involuntarily, unable to maintain the boundary between waking and dreaming consciousness, and so experienced waking life as potentially dreamlike, possibly false. We navigate this territory every night and every morning, dying into sleep and being reborn into waking, though we rarely notice the metaphysical significance of this cycle. Jung and Dick help us notice, help us see that consciousness is not a stable possession but a flickering flame that dims and brightens, that the self we are so certain of by day dissolves by night and must be reconstructed each morning. The dialogue between these two minds illuminates the fundamental mystery that consciousness is the only instrument we have to investigate consciousness. that we cannot step outside the psyche to verify our observations of the psyche. This would frustrate us if we needed certainty. But if we can accept uncertainty as the ground of being, then Jung's careful exploration and Dick's wild questioning both become paths of wisdom, different ways of honoring the mystery rather than pretending to solve it. Let your breathing deepen as the story of these two seekers settles into your awareness. They lived very different lives, occupied very different positions, used very different methods and languages, yet both dedicated themselves to the question of what consciousness is and what it can know. Both refuse the easy materialist answer that consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon of brain function, without necessarily embracing traditional religious answers either. Both found in the depths something that exceeded their categories, something that demanded new language, new frameworks, new ways of understanding. Jung gave us the collective unconscious, archetypes, individuation, the self, a rich vocabulary for the inner life that goes beyond Freud's narrow focus on sexuality and childhood trauma. Dick gave us the black iron prison, Valis, anamnesis, reality as simulation, a vocabulary for epistemological crisis and metaphysical horror that goes beyond both psychology and traditional philosophy. Taken together, they offer a stereoscopic view of consciousness, seeing from two different angles simultaneously, the psychological and the ontological, the therapeutic and the prophetic, the contained and the unbounded, the integrated and the shattered, both true, both partial, both necessary complements. In your own inner life, you likely recognize both. Times when Jung's framework fits your experience, when you can identify dream symbols, work with shadow material, sense the presence of archetypal patterns, and times when Dick's vision fits better, when reality seems uncertain, when you question whether your perceptions are trustworthy, when paranoia and insight blend indistinguishably. The modern world increasingly creates the conditions Dick described: reality mediated by screens, identity constructed through digital profiles, surveillance and data collection making paranoia rational, the sense that we are living in a simulation, not metaphorically, but literally as our lives move online. In this context, Dick's questions become not abstract philosophy, but practical concerns. How do I know what is real when so much is virtual? Who am I when my identity is a construct of algorithms and metrics? What is authentic in a world of manufactured experiences? Yet Jung's emphasis on the psyche as the ground of meaning remains relevant. However mediated and constructed reality becomes, we still experience it through consciousness. The psyche is still the lens through which everything is filtered. Working with dreams, attending to synchronicities, honoring the symbolic dimension, maintaining relationship with unconscious depths, these practices keep us connected to something deeper than the surface churn of contemporary existence. Perhaps what we need is a synthesis, a framework that holds together Jungian depth psychology and Dickian metaphysical vertigo. We need to work with the psyche as Jung taught, and also question reality as Dick demanded. We need the therapeutic and the prophetic, the integrative and the critical, the systematic and the wild. Such a synthesis would honor consciousness as both profound and problematic, both the source of meaning and the source of suffering. It would see individuation as a goal while also recognizing that some people cannot achieve it and must find meaning in bearing witness to permanent fragmentation. It would take seriously both the collective unconscious and the possibility that consciousness is even stranger than archetypes suggest, that simulation or divine invasion or ontological instability might be literally real. This synthesis would not resolve the tensions between Jung and Dick, but would hold them as creative opposites, maintaining the paradox rather than collapsing into either pole. It would be a psychology adequate to the complexity of contemporary existence, neither naively therapeutic nor hopelessly paranoid, but holding both as possibilities depending on what the situation requires. As your consciousness continues to soften towards sleep, you embody this synthesis naturally. You are relaxing control, allowing the unconscious to speak, trusting the process of sleep and dream as Jung would recommend. And you are also questioning, wondering, maintaining enough awareness to notice the strange transition from waking to sleeping consciousness, the way identity loosens and reality shifts. As Dick would observe with fascination and concern, in this liminal space, the boundary between Jung's archetypal realm and Dick's uncertain realities becomes permeable. Are the figures you might encounter in dreams archetypal patterns from the collective unconscious, or autonomous entities invading your consciousness? Is the dream state a natural regression to unconscious wholeness, or a vulnerability to external influences? Both possibilities remain open, and perhaps the answer is both. The gift Jung and Dick together offer those of us navigating consciousness in uncertain times is permission to hold complexity, to resist premature closure, to live in questions rather than rushing to answers that might be false certainties. They show that it is possible to explore deeply, to take inner experience seriously, to quest for truth without arriving at dogmatic final positions. Jung sought the truth of the psyche and found vast territories to map but never claimed to have mapped everything. Dick sought the truth of reality and found only more questions, but questions pursued with relentless honesty. Both models of intellectual integrity are valuable, the patient systematic explorer and the wild prophetic questioner. For you, listening now on the edge of sleep, both are available as inner resources. When you need grounding, call on Jung's steady therapeutic presence, his assurance that the psyche has structure and meaning even when it feels chaotic. When you need a question, call on Dick's prophetic skepticism, his refusal to accept comfortable lies even when truth is destabilizing. The conversation between these two minds continues in every person who takes inner experience seriously, who wonders about consciousness, who refuses to accept materialist reduction without embracing naive mysticism either. The dialogue is not historical but ongoing, taking place in each of us as we navigate between psychological and metaphysical, between integration and fragmentation, between trust and suspicion. As you sink deeper into rest, allow the specific details of Jung's and Dick's lives and works to fade into felt sense rather than conceptual knowledge. What remains is the quality of their dedication, their willingness to follow difficult questions wherever they led, their refusal to settle for easy answers. This quality is more important than any specific conclusion they reached. It is the courage to explore consciousness, knowing the exploration will change you, that you cannot return unchanged from the depths. Both men were changed by their explorations. Jung never fully recovered from his confrontation with the unconscious, spending the rest of his life trying to integrate and communicate what he experienced. Dick never recovered from his encounter with Valis, spending his final years trying to understand what had happened to him. Neither would have chosen the easier path of not exploring, of staying safely on the surface. The call to depth was irresistible for both, even knowing the cost. For those of us called to explore our own depths, their examples are both encouraging and cautionary. The journey is necessary and dangerous. It brings insight and also destabilization. It can heal and can wound. Preparation is important. Psychological resources, supportive relationships, practical life skills. But even with preparation, the depths remain unpredictable. The unconscious will give what it gives, not what we think we want or need. Jung and Dick remind us that consciousness is not fully under our control, that the ego is not master in its own house, that we are embedded in larger patterns and forces that have their own purposes. Accepting this is both humbling and liberating. We can stop pretending to have control we never had. We can open to guidance from depths wiser than ego consciousness. We can allow ourselves to be worked on by forces greater than ourselves. Yet both also insist on the necessity of consciousness, of not surrendering to the unconscious completely, of maintaining some degree of reflective awareness even in the midst of overwhelming experience. Jung maintained this through his disciplined recording and painting in the Red Book. Dick maintained it through writing, through the thousands of pages of exegesis where he tried to make sense of what had happened. For you, the practice might be different, keeping a dream journal, meditation, therapy, creative work, any practice that helps you maintain dialogue with the unconscious rather than identification with it. The specific practice matters less than the attitude, the willingness to honor both consciousness and unconscious, both ego and self, both the personal and transpersonal. As you drift into sleep, you practice this naturally. You let go of ego control while maintaining enough awareness to eventually remember you dreamed. This nightly practice is the model for the deeper explorations. Jung and Dick invite us to conscious engagement with the unconscious, dialogue between day and night, marriage of opposites that generates new awareness. The story of their dialogue is ultimately the story of consciousness trying to understand itself, the psyche investigating its own nature, using the only instrument available, which is the psyche itself. This recursive, paradoxical situation is both the glory and the frustration of consciousness. We can turn awareness on itself, become conscious of consciousness, but never fully because the observer is always part of the observed. Jung worked within this limitation systematically, carefully observing psychic phenomena while acknowledging the psyche cannot step outside itself to verify its observations. Dick struggled with the limitation less patiently, trying to break through to some observation point beyond the psyche, some verification of truth that does not depend on consciousness. Neither succeeded in the absolute sense because the task is impossible, but both succeeded in the important sense, bringing back reports from deep waters, mapping territories others had feared to enter. Their reports are gifts to all of us who follow, who undertake our own descents and ascents, who question our own realities and explore our own depths. We do not need to repeat their exact journeys, but we can draw on their courage and their insights, their different gifts and strengths, their complementary visions. May you rest in the tension they explored, the creative space between integration and fragmentation, between psychological and metaphysical, between therapeutic containment and prophetic wildness. May you trust your depths as Jung counsels, and question your surfaces as Dick demands. May you find your own way between their poles, your own synthesis or your own oscillation, your own relationship to the mysteries they dedicated their lives to exploring. As consciousness fades into sleep, the dialogue between Jung and Dick fades too, not ending but dissolving into the larger mystery both served. The questions remain: what is consciousness? What is real? Who am I? What is the relationship between psyche and cosmos? But the questions soften from urgent demands to gentle companions. present but not pressing, available when needed but not insisting. In the democracy of dream, Jung and Dick meet as equals, not as psychiatrist and patient, but as fellow explorers comparing notes from adjacent territories. They recognize in each other the same dedication, the same courage, the same willingness to pay the cost of going deep. Their differences in method and conclusion matter less in this space than their shared commitment to the quest. And you, drifting between waking and sleeping, between day consciousness and night mystery, join their company. Not as student to teachers, but as fellow consciousness investigating the only thing it can truly know, itself. The exploration never ends because consciousness is infinite in depth, always exceeding our frameworks, always revealing new layers beneath what we thought was bedrock, rest. Now, in this infinite depth, this mystery that Jung named collective unconscious, and Dick called Valis, and that remains beyond all names, trust the darkness as the space where new awareness gestates. Trust the unconscious as the source of renewal and wisdom. Trust the process of dissolution and reformation that happens each night as you sleep and each morning as you wake. The conversation between Jung and Dick continues in dreams, in the liminal space where their voices blend with the voice of your own deep psyche, all trying to tell you something important, something you need to hear, but can only understand gradually, over time, through repeated listening. Let that conversation happen without effort, without trying to grasp or remember. Let it work on you the way dreams work, bypassing ego consciousness to plant seeds in deeper soil. May you wake refreshed, carrying something from the depths even if you do not remember what, changed by the nightly descent even if the change is subtle. May you walk the waking world with both Jung's integration and Dick's questioning, both therapeutic groundedness and prophetic insight, both psychological wisdom and metaphysical wonder. The dialogue between these two great explorers of consciousness is ultimately your dialogue with yourself, the conversation every aware being has between the part that seeks wholeness and the part that questions everything, between the voice that says the psyche makes sense and the voice that says maybe nothing makes sense and that is okay. Both voices are necessary. Both are you. Sleep now, held by the great mystery both men served, resting in the tension they explored, trusting the darkness they entered and emerged from and entered again. Let their courage inspire your own explorations, their dedication deepen your own practice, their dialogue become your inner conversation, and let it all soften now into wordless awareness, into the silence beneath all theories, into the darkness that is not absence of light, but the source of light, the depths from which consciousness emerges and to which it returns each night, dying to be reborn.